The flight that changed everything. The airport bustled with energy as travelers hurried through terminals, dragging their suitcases behind them. The sound of rolling luggage, occasional flight announcements, and the chatter of passengers filled the air. Some were anxious, some excited, and others simply exhausted from long hours of travel. Among them was Brianna Cole, a poised and confident woman who had spent years building her career in the competitive tech industry. As a senior executive at one of the nation's largest technology firms, she was no stranger to hard work. The countless late nights, back-to-back meetings, and difficult negotiations had made her a powerhouse in her field. But now, after a week of high-stakes boardroom meetings, she was finally heading home. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer, a crisp white blouse, and tailored pants, Brianna exuded both elegance and authority. Her natural curls framed her face, and her posture was upright, unshaken by the chaos around her. She walked toward the priority check-in counter, her first-class ticket in hand, a small luxury she'd allowed herself after grueling work trips. This was her time to relax, to momentarily step away from the constant demands of her job, and simply breathe. As she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, the woman barely glanced at it before waving her through. There were no second glances, no unnecessary questions, just a routine scan and an approving nod. Brianna smiled politely and moved toward the jet bridge. Stepping onto the aircraft, she was greeted by the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee and leather upholstery. The first-class cabin was still mostly empty, as early boarding was one of the perks of premium seating. Brianna found her window seat -2A and neatly placed her carry-on in the overhead bin before sinking into the plush seat. She sighed, letting the comfort of the spacious first-class cabin soothe her tired muscles. Pulling out her tablet, she intended to skim through some emails before takeoff. This was a ritual, keeping her mind busy, even when she was supposed to relax. But before she could even type her password, a shadow loomed over her. A blonde flight attendant stood beside her, her blue uniform crisp and pristine, but her expression tight, scrutinizing. The name tag on her chest read Cassandra Miller. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Cassandra greeted with a forced smile. "May I see your boarding pass?" Brianna blinked. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching into her blazer pocket and pulling out the slip of paper. Hadn't she already been checked at the gate? With practiced ease, she handed the boarding pass to Cassandra, who took it without a word. The flight attendant's eyes darted between the pass and Brianna, her brows subtly furrowing. "I'll need to double-check this with the flight manifest," Cassandra said, her tone polite, but laced with something Brianna couldn't quite place. Brianna's jaw tightened. She had flown first class many times before and had never once been questioned after boarding. "Is there a problem?" Brianna asked, keeping her tone neutral. Cassandra's lips pressed into a thin line. "I just need to verify something. I'll be back shortly." Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked toward the front of the plane, leaving Brianna sitting there, staring at the spot where she had stood. A strange sensation settled in Brianna's stomach, a mix of irritation and unease. She glanced around the cabin. A few other first-class passengers had already taken their seats, but none of them had been asked for their boarding passes. Was she imagining things? Overreacting? Years of experience had taught her to pick her battles, but something about this felt off. Minutes passed, and Cassandra didn't return. Brianna's grip on her tablet tightened as she tried to push aside the nagging thoughts creeping into her mind. Then finally, Cassandra reappeared, this time holding a small tablet. She stopped beside Brianna's seat, her gaze still unreadable. "It seems there's been a mix-up," she said, her voice carefully measured. "Your seat may not be correctly assigned. I'll need you to move to economy while we sort this out." Silence. Brianna's fingers curled around the armrest. This was not happening. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. Cassandra tilted her head, her smile still plastered on, but her eyes sharp. "It's just a clerical error, ma'am," It happened sometimes. Brianna exhaled slowly, keeping her emotions in check. I don't think so. This is my assigned seat, and my boarding pass confirms it. I'm not moving. Cassandra's expression hardened. Ma'am, I need you to comply. Brianna's pulse quickened, but she remained composed. She looked around the cabin. People were watching now, some pretending not to, but their curiosity was obvious. And that's when it hit her. This wasn't about a clerical error. This was about her. A black woman in first class. Brianna inhaled deeply, then exhaled. Unless you can provide a specific reason why my ticket is invalid, I suggest you find another way to sort this out. I'm staying in my seat. Cassandra's polished smile faltered. The tension in the cabin thickened. More passengers were openly observing the exchange now. A man in a gray suit in 3C raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. A woman across the aisle whispered something to her husband. Cassandra's face flushed, but she quickly regained her composure. She glanced at her tablet again, tapping the screen as if searching for something to back up her claim. Brianna could feel her heart pounding, but her exterior remained cool, controlled. Finally, Cassandra let out a sigh. I'll have to consult with the captain. And with that, she walked away, leaving Brianna sitting there with the weight of countless eyes on her. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one longer than the last. Brianna kept her gaze fixed on the window, refusing to acknowledge the lingering stares. Her entire life, she had fought against being underestimated, dismissed, or questioned. But this was different. This was humiliation, served cold in a place where she had every right to exist. Then, Cassandra returned, this time accompanied by a younger flight attendant, a nervous-looking brunette. The young woman avoided eye contact as she stood behind Cassandra. Ma'am, Cassandra said, her tone stiffer now. We've reviewed the situation. You may remain in your seat. Brianna didn't blink. No apology, no explanation, just a begrudging acceptance. The younger attendant hesitated, then leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm really sorry about that. If you need anything, let me know. Brianna met her gaze, sensing the genuine discomfort in the woman's eyes. But she didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to her tablet, her fingers moving swiftly over the screen. She wasn't just sending an email. She was documenting everything. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Brianna leaned back in her seat, her mind already formulating a plan. The turbulence, she realized, was just beginning. The weight of silence, the hum of the engines vibrated through the cabin as the plane climbed higher into the sky. Outside the window, the city lights flickered beneath a vast, dark horizon, gradually shrinking into the distance. But inside Brianna Cole's mind, the tension from the earlier confrontation with the flight attendant Cassandra Miller still clung to her like static electricity. She sat upright in her first-class seat, fingers poised above her tablet screen, still documenting every moment of what had just happened. Every word exchanged, every glance she caught from the surrounding passengers. Her emotions churned, a mix of indignation, exhaustion, and something else, something heavier, a feeling she knew all too well. The weight of being questioned, the weight of not being believed. Across the aisle, a businessman in his 50s, a silver-haired man in a pressed navy suit, stole a glance at her, then quickly turned back to his laptop, pretending to be absorbed in his spreadsheets. A couple in row 1A and 1B spoke in hushed voices, their champagne glasses clinking softly. The woman, a blonde with pearl earrings, cast a wary look in Brianna's direction before averting her eyes. They had all witnessed it. They had all seen what happened. And yet, no one had said a word. Brianna exhaled, tapping the screen of her tablet with precision, her notes forming crisp paragraphs. She wasn't just venting. This was evidence. If Cassandra thought she could single her out and walk away unchallenged, she had severely miscalculated. But before Brianna could finish her notes, a shadow loomed over her again. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Cassandra Miller. The flight attendant stood stiffly, her smile noticeably forced, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" Cassandra's voice was overly polite, but the undertone of her words made it clear. She was trying to regain control of the situation, trying to smooth things over. Brianna slowly raised her eyes, meeting Cassandra's gaze head-on. "No," she said evenly. Cassandra hesitated. The refusal clearly unsettled her, but instead of pushing, she just nodded curtly and moved on. It was an awkward retreat. A younger flight attendant, the same one who had whispered her apology earlier, walked by, her expression filled with unease. Brianna didn't miss the way she avoided Cassandra's gaze, as if she too understood that something had been deeply wrong about what had happened. Brianna tapped a final note into her tablet and closed it, placing it gently in the seat pocket in front of her. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the flight attendants were now preparing for the in-flight meal service. Soft conversation filled the first-class cabin as passengers settled in for the long journey. But Brianna wasn't ready to let this go. Her mind was already mapping out her next steps. The unspoken conversations. Time passed. The meal service came and went. Brianna nibbled at her food, barely tasting it. She wasn't hungry. Her thoughts were too loud. A deep, familiar frustration sat at the pit of her stomach, a frustration she had buried too many times before. She had spent years, decades, working harder than necessary, proving herself over and over again, just to exist in spaces that were never meant for her. And yet here she was again. Questioned, doubted, targeted. She had to speak, not for herself, but for every other black woman who had been made to feel small in a space they had earned their right to be in. Brianna's gaze shifted across the cabin, her eyes lingering on the other passengers. She could feel their curiosity, their discomfort. And then, finally, someone spoke up. It was the silver-haired businessman from 3C. He leaned slightly toward her, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the quiet hum of the plane. "I saw what happened," he murmured, his expression unreadable. "That was unnecessary." Brianna turned to face him, studying his face. He had been watching. He knew. "Unnecessary," she repeated, her tone dry. "That's an understatement." The man sighed, rubbing his temple. "I've been flying first class for years, and I've never seen a flight attendant double-check a ticket after a passenger is already seated. That wasn't standard procedure. No, it wasn't." And they both knew why. The man hesitated before continuing. "If you file a complaint, I'd be willing to back you up. I mean, I don't know if it'll change anything, but I saw everything." Brianna appreciated the gesture, but she knew how these things worked. Complaints alone didn't fix a system. Action did. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice measured. "I'll be making sure this doesn't just disappear." The man nodded solemnly. "Good. You should." Across the aisle, the woman with the pearl earrings shifted uncomfortably. Her husband, a broad-shouldered man in a crisp blazer, cleared his throat as if to fill the silence. Brianna didn't care. She wasn't here to make them comfortable. The final test. As the flight continued, Cassandra avoided Brianna as much as possible, tending to every other passenger with an almost exaggerated politeness. But Brianna could still feel her presence, the stolen glances, the stiffness in her movements, the way she adjusted her name tag as if to reset her authority. When the pilot announced that they would begin their final descent, Brianna braced herself for what came next. She knew exactly what she had to do. The moment the plane landed and the seatbelt sign blinked off, passengers stood up, stretching, grabbing their belongings, checking their phones. But Brianna didn't move. She waited until Cassandra was forced to walk past her seat one last time. And when she did, Brianna spoke. "I'll be addressing this with the airline." Cassandra froze. Her face visibly paled. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came. Brianna just watched her, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything else. The damage was already done, and justice was already in motion. The ripples of resistance. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual post-flight chaos. Passengers hurried to baggage claim, checking their phones, stretching their limbs, and adjusting to the change in air pressure. Brianna Cole stepped off the plane with a deliberate calm, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Her carry-on bag rolled smoothly behind her, but inside, her mind churned like a storm at sea. The confrontation with Cassandra Miller was still fresh, the weight of it lingering in the air around her like humidity before a thunderstorm. She had made it clear, this wasn't over. And she had meant every word. As she moved toward the main concourse, she pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. The entire interaction, from the moment Cassandra first asked for her ticket to that final exchange before deboarding, had been carefully documented. She had names, she had timestamps, and she had witnesses. Her next step, making sure it reached the right people. A tap on her shoulder interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see the silver-haired businessman from 3C standing behind her. He looked hesitant, as if debating whether to speak. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything," he admitted, glancing around before lowering his voice. "But I wanted to make sure you were all right." Brianna studied him for a moment. He wasn't obligated to care. He could have just walked away, like so many others had. But he didn't. "I'm fine," she said, her voice even. "But I'm not letting this go." The man nodded, seemingly relieved by her response. "If you need a statement or anything, you can count on me. I saw everything." Brianna gave him a small nod of appreciation. "I'll keep that in mind." As he walked away, she turned back to her phone and began drafting an email. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen. 2. Airline Customer Relations. Subject: Formal complaint regarding discriminatory treatment on Flight 279. Dear Customer Relations Team, I am writing to formally report an incident of blatant racial discrimination I experienced at the hands of one of your flight attendants, Cassandra Miller, on Flight 279 from Chicago to New York. Despite having a valid first-class ticket, I was singled out, questioned multiple times, and asked to move to economy class under the false pretense of a seat mix-up. No other passenger in first class was subjected to this scrutiny. The attendant in question refused to acknowledge her mistake, offered no apology, and continued to treat me with condescension for the remainder of the flight. I have detailed notes of the entire encounter, as well as multiple witnesses who can confirm what took place. I expect an immediate response detailing the steps the airline plans to take in addressing this matter, including a review of training and policies to prevent such discriminatory behavior in the future. I look forward to your prompt reply. Sincerely, Brianna Cole. She read through it once, then again. Then, with one final breath, she hit send. Her pulse quickened, but her expression remained unreadable. Now, the waiting began. Back at the airline headquarters, while Brianna moved on with her evening, unaware of the internal ripple effect her complaint had just set off, the email landed in the inbox of the airline's customer relations team. By sheer chance, it was opened almost immediately by Stephanie Walters, a mid-level employee whose job it was to assess passenger complaints and determine their severity. Stephanie had seen hundreds of complaints before, angry passengers demanding refunds for delayed flights, lost luggage, rude attendants, but something about this one felt different. She read it again. Then a third time. She leaned back in her chair, chewing on her lip, before finally picking up the phone. "Yeah, but I think we have a situation here," she said into the receiver. Within 30 minutes, the email had been escalated to the airline's executive relations department. And within an hour, the CEO's office had been informed. Brianna Cole was not just any passenger. She was a high-level executive in the corporate world, and her name carried weight. They couldn't afford to brush this under the rug. Cassandra Miller feels the pressure. Meanwhile, Cassandra Miller had just finished another flight when she received a message from her supervisor, summoning her for an urgent meeting the following morning. Her heart dropped. She could feel it, the shift in energy, the way some of her coworkers had started whispering when she walked by. She knew something was happening. That night, Cassandra lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. For the first time since the incident, a gnawing feeling of doubt crept in. Had she really just been doing her job? Or had she let something else influence her actions? But before she could fully process it, her alarm buzzed. It was time to face the consequences. Brianna's next move. While Cassandra sat nervously outside her supervisor's office the next morning, Brianna was already 2 steps ahead. She had called a close friend, Andrea, a legal consultant who had experience handling corporate discrimination cases. "Do you want to take legal action?" Andrea asked over the phone. Brianna exhaled, staring out of her office window at the towering skyline of New York City. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I do want accountability." Andrea hummed in thought. "Then let's turn up the pressure." The next day, Andrea helped Brianna draft a second, stronger letter, this time directed straight to the airline's executive board. And as Brianna's complaint continued gaining traction internally, an anonymous social media post detailing a blatant act of discrimination by a major airline began going viral. Brianna hadn't posted it, but someone had been watching. And they weren't staying silent. The storm breaks. By the time the CEO's office finally responded to Brianna's complaint, it was too late to contain the situation. A journalist had picked up the viral post, and now news outlets were digging deeper. The airline's PR team scrambled to control the damage, issuing a generic statement about their commitment to diversity and inclusion. But Brianna wasn't satisfied with empty words. When a reporter called her office, asking if she had any comment, she gave them one sentence. "I want to see real change, not just apologies." The fight for accountability. The city was buzzing with activity as Brianna Cole stepped out of her apartment and into the crisp morning air. New York never slept, and neither did the fire burning in her chest. It had been 3 days since she filed her formal complaint against the airline, and the response she received was predictable. A generic corporate apology, dripping with carefully crafted language designed to sound regretful without admitting fault. It wasn't enough. Not even close. As she climbed into the back seat of her rideshare, her phone vibrated. "Andrea." She answered immediately. "Tell me you have good news." Andrea sighed on the other end. "I have news. Not sure how good it is yet." "Go on," Brianna prompted, already sensing that something was shifting. "They're scrambling," Andrea said. "Your complaint made it all the way to the CEO's office, and from what I hear, they're panicking behind closed doors." The social media backlash didn't help. Brianna leaned back against the seat, exhaling slowly. Are they actually taking action, or just hoping this blows over? Andrea hesitated. They called a private meeting. Senior executives, legal teams, HR, all of them. The fact that they're moving this fast means they see you as a serious threat. Brianna smirked. Good. They also put Cassandra Miller on administrative leave while they conduct an investigation, Andrea added. That made Brianna pause. So, they weren't brushing it under the rug. At least not yet. "Do you want to push further?" Andrea asked. Brianna looked out the car window, watching the towering buildings fly past. She had 2 options. Accept their weak apology and move on. Turn up the pressure until real change happened. The choice was obvious. "I'm not stopping," she said. Andrea chuckled. "I figured. Okay then, let's talk strategy." Cassandra's reckoning. Meanwhile, inside a sterile conference room at the airline's corporate headquarters, Cassandra Miller sat in stunned silence as her supervisor read from a file. "This is a serious matter, Cassandra." Cassandra clenched her hands in her lap, her nails digging into her palm. "We have multiple reports confirming that you singled out Miss Cole, questioned her first-class ticket without cause, and attempted to move her to economy despite her valid boarding pass. It was just protocol. Cassandra started, but her supervisor cut her off. No, it wasn't. And you know that. Silence. The weight of it settled heavily in the room. Cassandra's mouth felt dry. She had spent the last few days watching the fallout, the internal emails, the hushed whispers, the viral post that was gaining traction online. She had convinced herself that this was just another passenger complaint, something that would blow over after a few apologies. But now, this was bigger than she had ever imagined. You're officially on indefinite suspension while this is under investigation, her supervisor continued, and if it's determined that discrimination was a factor. Her voice trailed off, but Cassandra didn't need her to finish. She knew. Her job was on the line. For the first time since the incident, she felt a deep unease creep into her chest. Had she truly let her own biases dictate how she treated Brianna Cole? Had she really just destroyed her own career? The corporate damage control begins. Inside the executive boardroom at the airline's headquarters, the CEO sat at the head of a glass conference table, his hands clasped together in frustration. "This is a PR disaster," one of the senior marketing directors said, pacing the room. "The media is watching this closely. We can't afford another scandal." "How bad is it?" another executive asked. One of the public relations heads pulled up a tablet. "The social media post about the incident has been shared over 50,000 times. We've received hundreds of complaints from customers threatening to boycott our airline. And now, major news outlets are asking for statements." The CEO's expression darkened. "And Miss Cole?" "She hasn't spoken publicly yet," the PR head answered. "But she's clearly pushing back hard. If she decides to go to the media, we'll be in even deeper trouble." The CEO exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Then we need to get ahead of this." His eyes hardened as he looked around the room. "We're offering her a meeting. Immediately." The power shift. Brianna was in her office when the email came through. Her assistant, Kim, peeked in, her eyebrows raised. "You're gonna want to see this." Brianna took her phone and scanned the email. To Brianna Cole. From Executive Office, airline name. Subject: Invitation for discussion. "Dear Ms. Cole, we acknowledge your concerns and take this matter very seriously. We would like to invite you to a private meeting with our executive leadership team to discuss the steps we are taking to address this situation and improve our policies. Please let us know your availability at your earliest convenience. Sincerely." Executive name: Senior Vice President, Corporate Affairs. Brianna smiled. "Oh," she murmured. "Now they want to talk." Kim smirked. "I take it you're not just going to accept whatever solutions they throw at you." Brianna's expression hardened. "No, I'm going to make sure this never happens again." The meeting that changed everything. 3 days later, Brianna walked into the airline's corporate headquarters, not as a passenger, but as a woman demanding accountability. A team of executives waited for her in a sleek conference room. The CEO, the VP of HR, the head of customer relations. They greeted her with smiles, but Brianna saw through it. They weren't meeting with her because they cared. They were meeting because they had no choice. She took a seat, crossed her legs, and met their expectant gazes with unshaken confidence. "Let's get straight to the point," she said. "What are you actually going to do about this?" The CEO cleared his throat. "We've begun a full internal review of our policies." "No," Brianna cut in smoothly. "I don't want vague promises. I want real, actionable changes." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, the executives started talking. Mandatory anti-bias training for all employees. A new passenger advocacy department to handle discrimination complaints. A full review of hiring and promotion policies to ensure diversity. They were offering everything she had demanded. Brianna listened carefully, nodding at times, pushing back at others. By the time the meeting ended, she knew one thing for certain. They weren't just offering empty words. They were afraid of her influence. And that meant she had already won. Breaking the system. The air in the conference room was heavy, not with tension, but with realization. For the first time, Brianna wasn't just being heard. She was being listened to. The CEO sat across from her, his fingers laced together as he considered her words. The other executives, HR, PR, and operations, all sat stiffly, waiting to see how far she would push. And Brianna was just getting started. She leaned forward slightly, her voice cool and measured. "I understand that you're implementing new policies," she said, "but let's be real. These are just Band-Aids. Your airline isn't unique. This happens everywhere, on every level. The only reason we're here is because I had the resources to push back." Silence. She let it linger, watching their faces shift. Then she continued. "What about the people who don't? The passengers who get profiled and don't have the leverage I do? The ones who complain and get ignored? The ones who don't even bother complaining because they know it won't matter?" No one spoke. The VP of HR shifted uncomfortably. "We acknowledge that discrimination is a systemic issue, and we—" "Then fix it," Brianna cut in sharply. She wasn't here for corporate pleasantries. She was here to make them sweat. The CEO exhaled through his nose. "What are you suggesting?" Brianna didn't hesitate. "An independent passenger advocacy council." The executives exchanged glances. "What kind of council?" Brianna leaned back, her expression unshaken. "One that isn't controlled by your airline. One that handles complaints about racial profiling, bias, and discriminatory treatment on flights. Independent oversight, real accountability, and transparency." The PR director cleared his throat. "That's an extreme measure." Brianna smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Not nearly as extreme as what I experienced on your flight." Silence again. She let them sit in it. Finally, the CEO sighed, rubbing his forehead. "That would be a significant shift in policy." Brianna shrugged. "You want this to go away? Make the change." The HR director hesitated. "We'll have to discuss this internally." Brianna's expression hardened. "You do that. But let me be very clear. If you don't take real action, this doesn't stay in this room. I have options. The media, legal action, social advocacy groups. This is bigger than me now. So, what's it going to be?" The CEO locked eyes with her. And in that moment, Brianna knew. She had them cornered. Cassandra faces the consequences. While Brianna was rewriting corporate policy, Cassandra Miller sat in a much smaller, colder office. Her hearing with HR was not going well. "We've conducted our internal review," her supervisor said, flipping through a folder. "The findings show a clear pattern of behavior." Cassandra's stomach twisted. Pattern. The HR director pushed the folder toward her. Inside were multiple complaints from past passengers. Not just Brianna. 3 other complaints over the past 2 years. All from black passengers. All dismissed. Cassandra felt her throat close. She had thought Brianna's case was an isolated incident, a misunderstanding, something that had just gotten blown out of proportion. But looking at the files in front of her, the truth was staring her in the face. This wasn't an accident, her supervisor said. This was a pattern, and we can't ignore that. Cassandra swallowed. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. The supervisor's gaze was sympathetic, but firm. "You're being terminated." Cassandra sucked in a breath. She had seen it coming, but hearing it out loud, it hit her like a slap. She wanted to argue, to say it wasn't fair. But deep down, she knew she had done this to herself. The aftermath. Days later, the airline made a public announcement. Cassandra Miller was fired. A new independent passenger advocacy council was being formed. Mandatory anti-bias training was now required for all employees. The corporate world reacted swiftly. News outlets covered the policy changes, and Brianna received hundreds of messages from people who had experienced similar discrimination while traveling. Some offered support. Others thanked her for fighting back. And then one message stood out. It was from Cassandra Miller. An email. Brianna hesitated before opening it. Subject: Apology. Dear Ms. Cole, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to say that I'm sorry. I see now that what I did was wrong. I told myself I was just following procedures, but the truth is, I didn't question my own biases, and that's on me. I've lost my job, and honestly, I probably deserve it. But I also don't want to stay the same person I was on that flight. I'm working on it. I know that doesn't change what happened, but I just wanted you to know. I hope the changes you fought for make a difference. Cassandra. Brianna read the email twice, then closed it. She didn't know if Cassandra was truly changing or if this was just guilt talking. But in the end, it didn't matter. The fight wasn't about one flight attendant. It was about something bigger. And that battle, she had already won. A legacy of change. The news spread like wildfire. What had started as a single confrontation between a flight attendant and a passenger had transformed into something far greater. A corporate reckoning, a policy shift, and a wake-up call for an entire industry. Brianna Cole had won. But victory wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The airline's new reality. The press release from the airline's headquarters was short and carefully worded, but the implications were massive. Following a thorough investigation, the airline has made the decision to terminate flight attendant Cassandra Miller due to violations of our company's non-discrimination policy. We remain committed to fostering a culture of respect and inclusion for all passengers and employees. Effective immediately, the airline will launch an independent passenger advocacy council to oversee issues related to bias and discrimination. This council will operate separately from the airline's internal complaint system to ensure full transparency and accountability. We apologize for the distress caused to Ms. Brianna Cole and all those who have faced similar experiences. We are committed to change and will continue working toward a more equitable future for all travelers. It was as close to an admission of guilt as a major corporation would ever give. And it was all because of Brianna. The public reaction was immediate. Some people applauded the move, calling it long overdue. Others argued that one fired flight attendant didn't fix a systemic issue. But one thing was clear: the conversation had started, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. Cassandra Miller disappears from the spotlight. As the airline scrambled to control the damage, Cassandra Miller had gone completely silent. No interviews, no statements, no defense. She had vanished from social media, deleted her LinkedIn, and wasn't responding to messages from former coworkers. She had become the face of workplace discrimination, and the backlash was merciless. But for Brianna, Cassandra wasn't the focus anymore. The fight had moved beyond her. This was now about something much bigger. A new era in air travel. Brianna sat in her office, staring at her phone as email after email flooded her inbox. Passengers from across the country were reaching out to her. Some had stories just like hers. Others simply wanted to thank her for standing up. And then there were the corporate invitations, speaking engagements, panel discussions, even a request from the Department of Transportation for her input on new passenger protection regulations. She exhaled, rubbing her temple. This had become so much bigger than she had ever intended. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Andrea stepped in, holding 2 coffee cups. "You look like you need this," she said, handing one over. Brianna chuckled, taking the sip. "You have no idea." Andrea sat across from her. "So, what's next? You're basically the face of passenger advocacy now." Brianna sighed. "I didn't ask for that title." "No," Andrea agreed. "But you earned it." Brianna let those words sink in. She had started this fight to hold one airline accountable. Now she had the chance to change the entire industry. "Do you remember what I said to you that night?" Andrea asked. Brianna thought back. The night she filed the complaint. Yes, she remembered. "You told me I wasn't just speaking for myself," Brianna murmured. Andrea nodded. And you weren't. And now, you have a platform. What are you going to do with it? Brianna looked down at her phone, scrolling through the dozens of messages from travelers who had been ignored, dismissed, and humiliated. She had already won her battle. Now, it was time to win the war. The first test of the Advocacy Council. The new Passenger Advocacy Council was formed within weeks. Made up of legal experts, civil rights activists, and former airline professionals, it was designed to hold airlines accountable for bias-related complaints. And its first case, a black family in first class being asked to show their tickets 3 separate times, despite already being seated. Brianna sat in on the first review hearing, watching as the council questioned the airline's representatives. This wasn't just an empty PR move. For the first time, an independent body had the power to demand real change. And Brianna wasn't just watching. She was leading it. A call from Washington. The momentum kept building. Then, one day, Brianna's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered cautiously. "This is Brianna." "Miss Cole, this is Senator Jacqueline Foster's office. The senator would like to speak with you about new airline regulations on passenger protections. Would you be available next week?" Brianna felt her breath catch. Washington. Federal policy. This was bigger than the airline now. She had pushed the first domino. And now the entire system was starting to shift. She straightened in her chair. "Yes," she said, voice steady. "I'll be there. A flight unlike any other." Months later, Brianna found herself at the airport again, ready to board a flight. This time, she wasn't just a passenger. She was a symbol, a powerhouse, a force for change. As she approached the first-class boarding lane, a flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Cole," she said. There was no doubt, no questioning of her seat. She belonged here, and this time, the world knew it too. As she walked down the jet bridge, she smiled to herself. The battle was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Because now, she wasn't just fighting back. She was leading the charge, and nothing would ever be the same again. The revolution takes flight. The air was thick with change. What had begun as a single confrontation on a flight had now become a national conversation, a movement that refused to be ignored. And Brianna Cole was at the center of it all. A call from the White House. It had been 2 weeks since Brianna received the call from Senator Jacqueline Foster's office, inviting her to Washington to discuss new airline regulations. But now, as she sat in her office, scanning her latest emails, she saw something that made her breath catch. An invitation. From the White House. Subject: Presidential Advisory Committee on Airline Passenger Rights. Her heart pounded as she opened it. "Dear Ms. Cole, on behalf of the Office of the President of the United States, we would like to formally invite you to serve as a consultant on the newly formed Presidential Advisory Committee on Airline Passenger Rights. Your advocacy has sparked an important discussion on systemic bias, racial discrimination, and accountability in air travel. We believe your experience, expertise, and leadership will be invaluable in shaping policies that protect travelers from unfair treatment. We would be honored to have you join this initiative. Please let us know your availability. Sincerely, Office of the President." Brianna stared at the screen. It was official. She had started by holding one airline accountable. Now she was being asked to change federal law. A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. This fight, it was only just beginning. A new battlefront. The day before her trip to Washington, Brianna stood in front of a full-length mirror in her apartment, adjusting her blazer. Andrea sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "So, you're officially one of the most powerful people in the airline industry, and you don't even work in aviation." Andrea mused, smirking. Brianna chuckled, shaking her head. "It's not about power. It's about justice." Andrea arched an eyebrow. "And justice got you a seat at the president's table." Brianna couldn't deny it. She had fought for one moment of accountability, but the momentum had snowballed into something much bigger. Andrea stood, crossing her arms. "So, what's your plan when you get there? Give them the corporate-friendly version, or hit them with the hard truth?" Brianna met her gaze in the mirror. She didn't hesitate. They're getting the truth. The Washington Summit, the Presidential Advisory Committee on Airline Passenger Rights, was held in the West Wing, inside one of the most exclusive conference rooms in the country. Brianna walked in, her head held high, taking in the faces of those around the long, polished table. Senator Jacqueline Foster, the Secretary of Transportation, CEOs from multiple airline corporations, legal experts on passenger rights, and now her, a black woman who had been told she didn't belong in first class. Now she was sitting at a table that decided the future of air travel in America. The meeting began with formal introductions. Then, the president's senior policy advisor turned to Brianna. "Miss Cole, we've all read your case. We know what happened to you, but we'd like to hear it in your words." Brianna took a deep breath. And then, she told them everything. Not just about her own experience, but about the thousands of stories just like hers. About the passengers who were profiled, dismissed, ignored. About the unspoken reality of racism in elite spaces like first-class cabins. About how the airline industry had never been forced to answer for its biases, until now. She spoke for 45 minutes, uninterrupted. When she was finished, the room was silent. Even the airline CEOs, who had come in ready to defend themselves, had nothing to say. Finally, Senator Foster spoke. "I don't just want change, Ms. Cole," she said, her voice firm. "I want legislation." And just like that, Brianna knew. Real laws were about to be written. The airline industry strikes back. But not everyone was happy. The airline executives left the meeting furious. Brianna's testimony had painted their industry as broken, outdated, and discriminatory. And now, they had no choice but to respond. Within days, major airlines released statements defending their policies. One CEO even went on live television, saying, "We take racial discrimination very seriously, but we do not believe that airline staff are guilty of systemic bias." This was an isolated case, not an industry-wide issue. Brianna watched the interview from her office, shaking her head. "They're scared," Andrea commented, sitting beside her. "They should be," Brianna murmured. The airline industry was pushing back, but it was too late. Because Brianna wasn't fighting alone anymore. A national movement begins. Social media exploded with support for Brianna. The hashtag passengers deserve better went viral, trending for weeks. Activists, civil rights organizations, and celebrities spoke out, demanding legislation to prevent discrimination in air travel. And soon, it wasn't just about airlines anymore. Other industries were forced to look at themselves, questioning how they treated black and minority customers in luxury spaces. Hotels, luxury retailers, fine dining establishments. A revolution had begun, and Brianna had lit the match. The laws that changed everything. 1 year later, the first major airline discrimination law was passed. Mandatory anti-bias training for all airline employees, independent federal oversight for passenger complaints, heavy fines for airlines that failed to address discrimination cases. It was a historic victory. One that never would have happened if Brianna had stayed silent. And now, she was just getting started. The final flight. 1 year after that fateful confrontation, Brianna found herself boarding another flight. But this time, everything was different. The attendant at the gate smiled at her. The flight crew greeted her warmly. There was no questioning her ticket, no lingering stares, no humiliation. She stepped into the first-class cabin, this time, knowing she had helped make this space accessible for all. She settled into her seat, pulling out her phone. An email notification popped up. Subject: Invitation to Keynote Speech, International Conference on Racial Equity. She smiled. This fight, it had gone far beyond airlines. It was bigger than she had ever imagined. And as the plane soared into the sky, Brianna knew. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a leader, a trailblazer, and she was just getting started.